Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and loads of love to each and every one of you. I count myself so privileged and lucky to have such incredible listeners like yourselves. You guys really rock and you are incredible. So before we get started, don't forget to get that lovely hot cup of cocoa. Loads of love to each and every one of you. And let's get started with tonight's story. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Jaden and I'm from the tree-covered Appalachian mountain state called West Virginia. And it's known as the quintessential mountain state, as it's the only state in the Appalachian region. Its elevation is higher than any other state east of the Mississippi River. West Virginia capital is Charleston, and our state bird is the northern cardinal, and our flower is the rhododendron. I was born and raised in the historic town of Harper's Ferry, and this is a famous site of the age-old Civil War raid where the Shenandoah River meets the Potomac River. When I was about 10 years old, my family moved from Harper's Ferry to Charleston in West Virginia, which is where I still live all these years later with my lovely wife. My 2 boys have long since flown the nest and have got large families of their own these days. My wife and I still live in the delightful home where we raised our children here in Charleston. We reside in a delightful green leafy neighbourhood called Styles Point, and I live here in a pretty cottage-style home with a sizable front and back yard, with a beautiful pristine turf and ubiquitous amount of trees in the backyard. My story begins in about 2015, when I was 58 years old and my obstinate and pertinacious wife, Polly, was insisting on putting me on a drastically reduced calorie-restricted diet. My wife had never packed any punches, nor is she very subtle or kind with her words, but has always been brutally honest to the point where she can almost become offensive. It's lucky I have a thick rhino-like skin, or I think my confidence would be at an all-time low. I've been called a beached whale, a walrus and a hippo before, but I know my wife means well and is trying to shock me into doing something drastic about my weight. You look like you're 9 months pregnant, she told me, and even when I was at my heaviest when I was pregnant with our children, my stomach didn't look as massive as yours does. You really need to go on a diet. You look like an inflated beach ball, she remarked. Those words were not pretty to hear, but they fell on deaf ears anyway, as I've always enjoyed my delicious food. But I realised with horror that my wife meant business. I promise you, she began busily bustling around that kitchen of ours with open bin liners, doggedly throwing out all my favourite snacks and containers of ice cream into those bags. I knew by that determined no-nonsense expression written on her very serious face that I would be living on very meagre, insipid offerings in the weeks that followed. And as I suspected, I wasn't wrong. To make matters worse, my wife is a deplorable cook, boiling the life out of everything she rustles up in that kitchen. "What on earth are you doing?" I asked, looking mortified. "Removing temptation from you," she pronounced proudly, as she continued to pile all my favourite snacks into that bin liner. "You do not have any willpower whatsoever. You're like a pot-belly pig that just cannot stop eating. I need to take drastic action on your account, or else what kind of a wife would I be?" "A very nice one," I said. "One who doesn't deprive her husband of the good things in life. We only live once." "That's the problem, dear," scolded my wife. "I want you around for a very long time, and with your ballooning waistline, I'm gravely concerned with your health. You're clinically obese," she told me. And so began my tireless, cheerless weight loss journey. Every day my plate was piled up with a scant portion of boiled insipid-looking broccoli, lean fish or chicken, all cooked within an inch of its life. It was a challenge to eat such monotonous, dreary, tiresome food day in and day out. My stomach would make such gurgling, grumbling noises because it was not used to such a calorie deficit. Before long I was dreaming of burgers and fries, sticky spare ribs and tacos filled with mince, avocado and grated cheese. I would salivate longingly as I would imagine myself indulging in this delicious, delectable food. Boy, how I missed it so very much. I'm afraid to admit it to you, but one day temptation finally slaughtered my resolve to remain disciplined. On this occasion my wife was on her way to her local pottery class. I do not believe I'd been more pleased to see her leave our premises as I was then. I was actually almost whooping with delight when I heard her car driving away from our premises. I remember piping out ecstatically, "Yay! Yay! She's gone!" It was like the age-old adage, when the cat's away, the mice do play. I kid you not, with the countenance of an exuberant dog about to get a juicy, succulent fillet steak now that the owner was away, in moments after my wife had driven off, leaving the back door wide open, I dived into my truck as fast as I possibly could, and I sneakily ambled off to Taco Bell, where I brought myself a cheesy beef burrito, some potato chips, along with a chocolate milkshake. I remember jubilantly creeping back into our house like a furtive, villainous burglar, knowing I was doing something naughty and devilishly sinful as far as my wife was concerned. But guess what? I didn't care at all. My childhood memories of my misbehaving wayward ways came flooding back, and I felt like an unruly kid all over again. It did feel rather good to cheat and get away with something, I have to admit. It gave me a feeling that I'd got one up on my wife. I hurriedly began to open my burrito package as fast as I possibly could. In fact, anyone observing me would have believed I had not seen food in decades, and had emerged from the depths of the jungle starving and desperate. But I was, in a way, I suppose, because without putting too fine a point on it, my wife's insipid, bland food had left me longing for this moment, with a burning desire that could not be quashed or suppressed. It just couldn't. I crammed that burrito into my open mouth with a ravenous enthusiasm, and I took a scrumptious bite. Oh, words fail to describe the flavoursome taste of the melt-in-the-mouth cheese, with seasoned savoury mints oozing out of that burrito, with a rich, fragrant, savoury aroma, titillating my taste buds in a wild frenzy. I was in Ambrosian food heaven. Oh, this is so good, I said to myself, tucking into the appetising burrito with great gusto. It was delicious, palatable, and yummy. All of a sudden I heard this strange voice saying, "Who's a naughty boy?" I looked around, feeling my face growing red with embarrassment, as I sensed that I'd been caught red-handed, with my fingers in the cookie jar, so to speak. I gave our living room the once-over, but no one was there. And then I heard it again. "Who's a naughty boy?" If that wasn't bad enough, the voice said, "I know what you did. I know what you did. Who's the naughty boy?" I was wondering where the voice was coming from, and I was feeling certain that someone was spying on me. And I had in some way been set up. I even wondered if my wife had some sneaky hidden device with an inbuilt camera waiting to catch me out if I cheated on my diet. I would never put anything past her, as she can be as stringent and strict as an army officer. Once again the voice repeated itself. "Who's a naughty boy? I know what you did. Put the kettle on." I don't know what made me look up towards the ceiling, but to my astonishment, perching there on the bookshelf was this large white parrot, with an underlay of mother-of-the-pearl peachy feathers, and he was beautiful. The parrot kept regarding me with his bright, dark, curious eyes, and to my amazement he flew down from the bookshelf and landed on my shoulders with a cocky sense of self-assurance, almost as if he'd known me all my life. He began to nibble my ear, and he kept saying to me, "Who's a naughty boy? I know what you did. Put the kettle on." I began to laugh and laugh, so much so that my stomach was aching. I can assure you that my rather humorless wife was not amused to find a parrot on my shoulders when she returned home from her pottery class. "Where on earth did you get that parrot from?" she said, looking at me suspiciously. "You didn't go and buy him behind my back, did you?" she asked. "I'd never put anything past you. You and the kids have always tried to squirrel animals into the house behind my back. Don't think I don't know about that." "Of course I didn't go and buy it," I said. "It must have flown into the house when I left the back door open, when I went into the yard. I found it perched on the bookshelf there." My wife's eyes darted towards the bookshelf warily. "You don't think he's been distributing his droppings up there?" she asked in alarm. "Calm down," I said. "Parrots are very clean birds." "Well, you're not keeping him," said my wife. "He must belong to someone. We'll have to find the owner as soon as we possibly can. You need to make some calls right now. Phone all the vets and rescue places, and make up some leaflets." "Yes, dear," I said. I knew better than to argue with my wife. My wife Polly is exceedingly house-proud, and I could see that she was more than a little worried about the state of her immaculate furnishings and her pristine spick-and-span house. Over the years, even my sons begged her for a dog or cat, but that was never ever going to happen, because she was very ill-disposed towards having pet hares in our home. I remember she did bend the rules once and allowed my son to have a hamster because the poor little mite was safely tucked away in a cage. I do recall one day when the hamster escaped and was running around our squeaky clean furniture, my wife began to scream blue murder. "Get that dirty thing out of here," she cried out in disgust. I promise you, she pugnaciously charged around that house of ours like a headless chicken with a broom in her hand. She battered that broom around the place as she tried to extract the hamster from under the sofa. "It's going to spoil my furnishings," she shrieked. Luckily, my son did manage to retrieve the frightened hamster and return it safely back to its cage. My wife would complain tirelessly about the noise the hamster made at night, going around and around on its wheel. "Won't that thing ever shut up?" she'd complain, throwing a pillow over her head, trying to get to sleep. Over the years, my sons privately confided in me at how much they resented their mother for not allowing them to keep animals. I empathised with their plight, as I knew all too well how they felt, for as a young boy I had grown up with animals myself. I emphatically believe that our house was not really complete without a dog or a cat, as a joyful ball of rambunctious energy with a wagging tail would have been a welcome addition to our home, I assure you. "All my friends have dogs," my son Lincoln would complain. "Can't you speak to her dad for me, please? I beg you. I want a dog so badly." "Son," I would say, "you know your mother is scrupulous about cleanliness. I honestly don't think I'll be able to talk her around." But despite my best efforts, my wife opposed to anything with fur residing in our home, and so it was a losing battle for the all of us. Fast forward a few weeks, and we had not found the owner of the parrot, and no one had come forward to claim the bird. I bought a very attractive gilded gold cage that I surreptitiously placed in the corner of our living room, and in the weeks that followed, a miracle transpired to my wife. It was like she metamorphosized into a whole new woman. I could hardly believe it. For some incongruous, unexplained reason, she began to develop a relationship with this very garrulous bird, who just loved to talk and talk and talk. And for some peculiar reason, this incredible parrot had literally melted my wife's heart in a way that no other animal had ever done before. It had almost broken through that hard exterior and touched the very core of her soul. And I was so transfixed by this extraordinary turn of events. You'd have to know my wife to understand. I would literally catch my wife cleaning the living room, fully engaged in a heart-to-heart conversation with the parrot, and I could tell by her animated demeanour that she was totally smitten by the bird. "Who's a good boy?" I would hear her say. "Who's a pretty boy? Such a handsome boy." The parrot would cock its head from one side to another as if he understood every word that she was saying, and he would say, "Who's a pretty boy? Who's a pretty boy? Who's a pretty boy?" I would hear my wife squealing with laughter. When I suggested we should try and find a home for the parrot, my wife kept fobbing me off. "That won't be necessary, dear." I played my wife at her own game, and I would say, "But we need to get rid of him as soon as we possibly can. He's a very dirty bird. We don't want something like him around." "No, he's not," said my wife, coming to his immediate defence. "He's very clean, I'll have you know. And besides, I think he's very happy here." If that wasn't shocking enough for you, believe me, there were occasions she'd let him out of his cage to perch on her shoulders while she hoovered the entire house. I even sent photographs of her to my dumbfounded sons, who contacted me immediately and said, "Dad, is this some kind of a wind-up?" They couldn't believe my fastidious wife was allowing the parrot free rein over our living room, as this would never normally have happened. My wife always made me take my shoes off before I walked over our cream carpet, but guess what? That parrot could do anything he liked. I was almost jealous of the bird, the hold it had over my wife. "Remind me when I visit you next," Lincoln teased, "to take some pointers from that sharp parrot. He's got Mum under his thumb, or should I say talon." Polly and I decided to call the parrot Tattletale for obvious reasons, because his vocabulary consisted of, "I'll call the police. I know what you did. Who's a naughty boy? I'm going to tell." All these were sayings he'd learnt from his previous owner, who had never come forward to claim him, much to the delight of my wife, who was exceedingly bonded to the parrot by now. I honestly think it would have torn her to pieces if the parrot was ever claimed, and if she had to choose between me and the parrot, I think I stood a better chance of being turfed out of the house than he did. You may wonder what all this has to do with a Bigfoot encounter, but I emphatically assure you, as is always the case with the assemblages of life, it would seem that everything is inexplicably linked, much like a vast spider web of silken fibres that come together to create the web. So it is with the master plan of life, as choices invariably lead to outcomes, and getting tattletale was a catalyst that ultimately led to our Bigfoot encounter. It would seem that our beautiful parrot precipitated and enkindled in us a fervent passion for birds. Before long, we were not only watching our own garden birds intently, but had joined a fanatical bird-watching group here in West Virginia, something that would never normally have happened. We would get regular updates, calls and SMSs telling us exactly where a rare bird had been sighted. It was incredible that my wife and I had developed such an ardent passion for birds. I promise you our enthusiasm was boundless, and in our frenzied excitement we would drop absolutely everything in a heartbeat and race to the truck, sometimes driving for miles, to see if we could spot the unusual bird. It would seem that even my wife's housework was forsaken and put on hold if there was an interesting bird in our vicinity. I remember thinking to myself one day how much tattletale had literally changed our lives, because my wife had blossomed and was so much less overwrought and wound up about managing the affairs of our home, and thankfully a little less preoccupied with the state of my expanding waistline. For a while I was able to get away with the odd burrito or packet of Oreos without my wife throwing a wobbly. We began to make so many brand new friends in the bird-watching community. My wife would sometimes be on the phone for absolute hours, with Tattletale perched on her shoulders, nibbling her ears affectionately, while she talked to fellow bird-watchers. The conversation was always the same. "Where did you see it? Did you hear its call? What was the colour like?" Polly and I are very lucky to live here in the mountain state from a bird-watching point of view, because we've seen so many rare birds. We have been privileged over the years to encounter some rather unusual birds. We've seen a northern saw, which is an owl that is so tiny it can fit into the palm of your hand. We've also observed the rose-breasted grosbeak, the Baltimore oriole, the golden-winged warbler, and some of the rarest wood warblers in the world. And not only did we have physical sightings of these birds, but even attained rare photographs of these incredible feathery wonders of nature's, of which my wife has enlarged and framed, putting in pride of place on the kitchen wall. Who would have thought that a feathery creature would turn up in our lives unannounced, move in and completely change our lives, so much for the better, in ways I never imagined possible. But weirder things have happened to people. One day my wife and I received a belated SMS that 2 pale blue curculin warblers had been spotted in an area of forest which was about 45 minutes' drive from where we actually lived. My wife and I frantically climbed into the car, and as I drove, she was finding all the details about this sighting from Owen, who had actually sighted the bird, and was extracting all the information from him that she possibly could. "Owen says it was spotted about 6 hours ago," she said, looking at me with a deflated look. "I think we've possibly left it too late. The birds have possibly already flown away. Just our luck. What a bummer." I could see that my wife was looking so desperately downcast, and I put my hand on her thigh and gave it a little squeeze. "It doesn't mean that we should give up," I said encouragingly. "You never know. It might still be there." My wife did not say anything, as her glazed eyes looked out of the car window with a vacant expression, and I could sense she was more than a little upset. "Look," I said, "even if we don't see the curculin warbler, we may spot another unusual bird there." "But I want to see the curculin warbler," said my wife. "Everyone in our group has seen the bird except for me. Now I'm going to miss it all over again. It's not fair." Before long I was driving my truck down the most remote rocky road that was so precarious that it was jolting and wobbling all over the place, and the stones were beating violently against the undercarriage, but nothing was going to stop us for what we were planning to do. "Goodness, this really is remote," said my wife, glancing out of the window at the undulating verdant valleys and exquisite mountainous views. "It must have been spotted over there, in that thick area of wood green," said my wife. "Owen said the birdwatcher observed it perched on a cypress tree, and he said there are lots of different trees in that woods, but there's barely any cypresses, so it should be easy to spot the bird, if he's still perched up in that tree." As we ventured into the woods, my heart started pumping excitedly, as the adrenaline coursed through my veins. This always seemed to happen to me on our bird-hunting expeditions, and it would seem it was no different for my wife, as her countenance looked eager and enthusiastic, full of hopeful anticipation. Words fail me to ever describe the magnificence of this remote wooded location, as it was off the charts in its wondrous beauty. I promise you this shaded retreat just took my breath away. The trees towered up into the clear blue firmament like tall regal skyscrapers, and their exquisite voluptuous trunks were swathed in resplendent carpets of rich velvety emerald moss. The vast canopy was splayed out like an elegant fan, and between the elevated branches sunlight twinkled and dappled the forest floor in a luminescent, subtle light. The forest floor was covered in rocky boulders and outstretched lacy ferns, along with some flowering purple mazes, which is native to the Himalayas, along with composite daisies with their distinctive purple fringes, and some flowering sage. My wife and I silently trailed through the wooded area, as we had learnt from bitter experience that some of the bird life got skittish if one got up too close. So we were very quiet as we trekked through this wood green. There were ancient hiking trails that were clearly not in use anymore, as they were so overgrown, and the trail signs were no longer even legible, and the wood on the signage was totally warped. I marvelled at this natural, wondrous oasis. Even if we didn't spot the Curculine warbler, I knew that just visiting this enchanting, magical sylvan was a complete pleasure. Much of the trail was very steep, surrounded by rocky boulders, and there was a pretty picturesque stream that meandered through the valley, and I could hear the sound of the white water jetting over the rocks. It was incredible. "I feel like we're in a magical place," whispered my wife. "If I was a Curculine warbler, I'd never leave it." "Shh," I whispered. "Hear that?" "Hear what?" asked my wife. "A whistling sound," I said. "It sounds like something or someone is whistling." We moved towards the sound, and I beckoned for my wife to hide, because someone was coming. And whatever or whoever it was, it sounded like something very heavy was walking up the path, and by heavy I mean something alarmingly big. I wasn't sure what it was, but I sensed that my wife and I needed to be very careful. We could hear the whistling getting closer and closer, and then we saw him, and I just remember my mouth hung open in astonishment. I knew I was observing a Bigfoot. This one was exceedingly different to most general descriptions I've ever heard over the years, because this Bigfoot was covered with long white hair, very similar in colour to that of a polar bear, but it wasn't an albino Bigfoot. It was blonde in colour, and it walked upright like a man, with long, slender, muscular legs, and a powerful V-shaped torso that rippled with muscle. He had the kind of body that would take hours of arduous, gruelling workouts in the gym to attain, rather like Arnold Schwarzenegger in better days. The critter looked much like a man, but there were ape-like influences to his appearance, most especially the overlong arms and the pyramid-shaped face. As he walked, he moved his arms backwards and forwards, and he seemed to glide with a seamless grace, almost as if he was floating. In that moment, I believe I was suspended in what seemed like an altered sense of consciousness, as my complete sense of bewilderment had hijacked my fear. I just thought, my God, what on earth am I seeing? For I had indeed been cynical about the critter, believing he was as bogus as the tooth fairy, and yet now I was seeing him larger than life in our reality. I could see that Polly was shaking like a jelly and was absolutely terrified, but I also could sense that she was in awe at the same time about what we were discerning. I beckoned for her to be very still. The critter then stopped whistling, and he seemed to be looking up in a Pacific tree, and he stood very still watching the tree with an expression of pleasure on his face. I pondered as to what he could be looking at, and then I heard 3 buzzy notes followed by 4 fast warbles, and then I realised to my amazement he must have spotted the Curculine warbler, and then the Bigfoot did the most extraordinary thing. He actually copied the warbler's song, and I could see a speck of light blue studding the Bigfoot, and the bird boldly stood on the edge of the branch and began to sing to it. I've never ever seen anything happen like that before, for indeed no bird has behaved like that to me, apart from our parrot. I could see that the Bigfoot was enamoured by the bird as much as we were, if we were watching it at such close quarters. He beheld it for a little longer, emulating its buzzes and warbles, with a delighted expression upon his leathery face. I discerned his skin colour was that of a Caucasian man, and I noted that the critter had deep-set green eyes, a distinct wrinkled brow ridge, a flat nose and thin lips. He did have a patch of black hair down the front of his torso in a long vertical line. I don't believe the critter was very old. I think he was a young but mature male. He glided through the woods whistling happily to himself, and my impression of him was that he was a gentle creature with a true appreciation of the natural world, and loving all the animals upon it. All of a sudden we saw the blue Herculean warbler fly past us as it almost followed the Bigfoot out of the wood green, but then it flew back to the tree it had perched on before. I was astonished, and my wife and I enjoyed watching it for 20 long minutes, until finally it flew away into the wood green, and we decided to call it a day. When my wife got back into the car, she exploded with excitement. "Did you see what I think we saw?" she asked. "We did indeed," I said. "It couldn't have been anything else." "But it was all white, and it had green eyes," she said. "You don't hear about Bigfoots like that." "Well, maybe they're like humans," I suggested, "with colours ranging from browns to blacks to blondes and reds. And maybe the blonde ones are more rare." "You know," my wife said, "I think you're right." I must say it's been about 5 years since we last saw the Bigfoot, but we still talk about it as if it happened yesterday. I will never be able to forget that critter because it made an enormous impression on me. I realised also that it had such a huge appreciation for the natural world, which really made me respect him a lot. As you can imagine, I'm still battling with my weight 5 years on, and look like I'm heavily pregnant. My wife has reconciled herself to the fact that I must just have a dreadful metabolism, and is oblivious to the fact that when her back is turned away, I get into my truck and squirrel away a few delectable takeaways. My wife is forever reminding me of the athletic Bigfoot that we saw, and saying how lovely it would be if I would have a body to match his. I think to myself, "In your dreams, Polly. That is never going to happen." And as for Tattletale, he's still one of the greatest blessings in our lives, and I have surreptitiously managed to increase his vocabulary. When I bring my secret stash of takeaways into the house, I always say to him, "I'm a very bad boy, and what will Polly say?" And Tattletale is always saying to Polly, "I'm a bad boy. What will Polly say? I'm a bad boy. What will Polly say? I'm a bad boy. What will Polly say?" My wife thinks it's all terribly funny, but she doesn't know that Tattletale has told her my dark secret, so I really do have the last laugh. So there you are. That's my story. Oh, I loved that story. What a wonderful story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.